this video, I want to take a look at creating custom blocks in Drupal 8. Specifically creating blocks from the perspective of a module developer. So how in my code do I create a block that someone can then go ahead and place in the layout using the blocks and layouts tools in Drupal 8. In a blog post a couple of weeks ago, Kyle took a look at some of the improvements to the blocks and layouts tools in Drupal 8, and that got me really excited about what you can do with blocks now. And I thought it would be appropriate to follow up with as a developer, how do I create a block that someone can place using those layout tools? So let's take a look at how we can do this. I'm going to be building off of a module that I had written in a previous blog post. The module here is named Chad. The source code for this module is available on GitHub. You can grab it at github.com/Drupalize.Me/Chad. It contains code from a couple of previous videos, and it also contains the code that we're going to be writing in this video. Making this block was a bit of an experiment for me. I hadn't really dealt much with the block system in Drupal 8 in probably a year or more, and there's been quite a bit of changes made to how we implement blocks in Drupal 8. So I'm going to walk you through both the code that I wrote, but also through the process of how I figured out what code to write. I started by going to Drupal.org. You can start by looking for information on Drupal.org. The place to start is going to the documentation handbook, scrolling down to developer guides, clicking on Develop for Drupal. From there, you'll find the module developers guide. So I went there. And then from the module developers guide, I clicked on this link, working with the Drupal API, which took me to this kind of top level handbook page, which gets a bit more in depth with each of the Drupal APIs. Specifically, I'm interested in Drupal 8, so I went to the Drupal 8 APIs. And from there, I found the block API in Drupal 8 page. When I initially came here, there was some content, but not a ton. So in addition to figuring out how the system worked, I've also tried to document that here as best that I could. This should now be a really good starting point for understanding how to create a block in Drupal 8. And we're going to walk through this process. If you've created blocks in Drupal 7 before, you've probably implemented hook block info and the corresponding block save, block load, etc. hooks. Those hooks are all gone in Drupal 8. Blocks in Drupal 8 are now created by creating what's called a plugin. So we're going to create a block plugin and use the annotation system so that Drupal can locate our plugin and understand that it's a block and know what to do with it. And then finally, we're going to implement methods from the block plugin interface so that when Drupal locates our block, it knows how to get its content as well. Let's walk through and do all of that. I think the easiest way to understand how all of this works is to take a look at an existing block. So if we switch over to our code editor, I'm just going to take a look at some of the blocks that are implemented in Drupal core. So in the core directory, I'll open up one of the modules. So core modules, we can take a quick look at, say, the book module, which I know provides a block. And the location of the code for that is in book, lib, Drupal, book, plugin, block. This is the PSR 0 standard in practice. It's just a way so that Drupal can know where to find this file, the book navigation block.php file, which contains the definition of this block. This shows that, so we've got a plugin here in Drupal 8. We've got a new class named book navigation block, which is an extension of the block base class. So that's maybe a good starting point. We know that we've got a base class that we can extend to create our own custom block. We've also got this bit of code right here, or not code, but the comment for this class. This is a specially formatted comment called an annotation. Specifically, this part. It starts with @block and then ends with this closing parenthesis. What this is doing is describing some of the metadata about our block, similar to what hook block info did in Drupal 7, where it defined like the machine readable name of our block and the administrative label and so forth. In Drupal 8, with the plugin system, we use annotations to provide that information. Drupal then has a annotated plugin discovery mechanism, which will read in these annotations and use it to know that this particular plugin is an implementation of a block, so it should be treated as such, that it has an ID and an administrative label, and here's that bits of information. And because it's an implementation, at the end of the day, of the block plugin interface, it's going to have methods on it like build or block form, which Drupal knows exists, so it can call those when it wants to display the content of our block. So that's one example. There's a ton of other examples in core as well. And one of the things that I did when I was trying to learn how to do this, create a block, was really just kind of start copying and pasting the examples from core and learning from them. I found the book navigation block to be pretty straightforward. I also took a look at some of the forum posts or forum blocks. I went to the forum module, same thing, lib, Drupal, forum, plugin, block. There's 3 of them in here. The forum block base was of most interest here because it kind of is a base class that the other 2 forum blocks extend. And this was a great way to kind of understand more of how the block system worked. So I recommend taking a look at how core implements its blocks. Let's go ahead and create one of our own. So I'm going to close all of this Drupal directory stuff here. And in the root modules directory, I've got a custom module named Chad. The first thing I'm going to need to do is just create a PHP file in the appropriate location. In this case, that's going to be lib Drupal Chad, name of our module. This is a plugin, so I'm going to create a new directory here called plugin. And then in the plugin directory, this is a block plugin, so I'm going to create a directory named block. And then finally, I'm going to create a file that will contain our block. So I'll create a new file. I'm going to name this file chadblock.php. We'll talk about that in just a second. But this is the PSR0 standard at work. And really, while it's verbose, what this does is it allows Drupal to know where to look to find implementations of block plugins. As long as you follow the pattern, Drupal will locate this chadblock.php file and load it when it's necessary. So this is just a standard PHP file. Looking at the examples from Drupal core, I know that I want to extend the Drupal block base class. So let's start by just doing that. We'll define our class and extend the block base. We'll add a namespace, like so. So we can namespace our specific block, and then we'll create a new class that extends the block base class provided by Drupal. Since we're extending block base here, we'll also need to make sure that we add a use statement so that PHP knows which block base class we're talking about. So there we go. If you're curious about the block base class and what it contains and how this works, you can find that by going to, looks like it's in core, modules, block, lib, Drupal, block, and then this block base.php. We can open that up and we can see what the base class provides us. The block base class extends plugin base and implements block plugin interface. And then it's got a bunch of methods here that get configuration, set configuration. It looks like it's inheriting these from the plugin base, configuration details, an access function, build configuration. There's some, you can kind of get a sense of what this block-based plugin does. The biggest thing that it does is it provides us with the configuration form that an administrator sees when they're configuring our block. So the thing that contains the field for, title of your block and visibility settings and so forth. That's all here in this build configuration form. If we extend block base, our block will inherit that configuration form. We can make changes to it if we want to by overriding these methods. The other interesting thing here is this block plugin interface, which the block base implements. If we take a look at the definition for that, you'll see that the block plugin interface just defines a bunch of empty methods. The idea is that when you're creating a block, you're implementing this interface, and you need to create, or you need to implement these methods in your block class. And that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to implement this build method, which builds and returns a renderable array for this block plugin. And by doing so, Drupal will know, okay, your plugin is a block, which means when I want to display its content, I'm going to instantiate your class and then call the build method. And I expect that to return the content you want to display. Let's take a look at implementing that over in our custom block here. So we've got class Chad block, which extends the block base class. The class name here and the location of the file, again, just following the PSR0 standard. Let's go ahead and add a simple build function here. So I've added a public method named build that returns a simple renderable array. I've said just go ahead and inherit the documentation from the thing that you are extending. This is just kind of a common PHP doc block syntax in Drupal 8. And I'm simply returning the content hello world. If I save that, I've now got a block plugin that when loaded and instantiated and the build method is called, will return the text hello world, so Drupal can display that in the content area for this block on the page. I still need to add an annotation to this block. Without an annotation, Drupal won't know that this is a block plugin, that it needs to be displayed in the block administration screen, and so forth. So let's go ahead and add that annotation. The annotation is going to be in a comment at the top of our, right above the definition of our class here. We'll say, and then what do I put in this annotation? Again, the easiest way to get an idea of what to put here is just to look at what other modules in Drupal core are doing. So I might, for example, go and find that forum block again and just copy and paste the content from there. So let's try that. I'm going to go to core modules. I'll open the forum module. We'll open just one of these blocks. I can see that it's got some annotations here, right? That line there. I'm going to copy and paste that into my module. Needs an extra line there, like so. And then I can make changes to this as are appropriate for my module. I'll say Chad block. And we'll put it into the category of custom blocks, like so. If you're curious about the annotations, there's a couple of other places that you can look to figure out what's going on here. One of those is the documentation on Drupal.org. If we switch back to Drupal.org, there's a couple of links from the block API in Drupal 8 page that are interesting. One of them is this plugin API page, which gives a explanation of the plugin system and more details about how it works. It's all about creating reusable pieces of code in a standard way so that Drupal knows where and how to locate the code and how to execute it. And then specifically, there's this annotations-based plugin discovery. This page gives some details about the specific annotation system that we're looking at now, and actually talks about doing it for blocks. If you're curious, give this page a read and it'll give you more details. Another thing that I like to point out is if we go back to our code, how do I know what I can put into one of these annotations for a block? If I look at the block annotation class, so I can go to the block module in block lib Drupal block annotation, there's this block.php file which contains the block annotation, and it lists ID and admin label as properties of this block. This right here is actually just documentation. This isn't code that Drupal ever actually executes. It's here solely for the purpose of explaining what are the possible properties of this annotation. And it actually looks like there's a couple of them missing right now, because as we saw, there's a category one at least that we could implement. So that's probably something that needs to get updated in Drupal 8. Adding those additional properties to this annotation class. So that though is where I would look to find out more about the annotations and what's available. I struggled a little bit initially to figure out, okay, I know that I have to write an annotation, but what goes in the annotation? And so looking at the documentation on Drupal.org and then looking at the annotation class for the plugin type that I'm implementing, in this case blocks. Annotations are Drupal 8's way of replacing the hook block info that we used in Drupal 7. Hook block info, if you remember, returned an array of information that was sort of metadata about our block. It had the delta for our block, which in this case is the ID, the machine readable name of our block. It provided an administrative label, and it also provided the name of PHP functions that the block system in Drupal 7 should call when it wanted to do things like display the content of a block. We don't have that concept of callbacks anymore because now we're implementing an interface. So Drupal knows that this class is an implementation of the block plugin interface by virtue of the fact that it's extending block base. And it knows that if it's an implementation of that interface, it's going to have this build method, which it can call in order to get the content of our block. All right, really, let's see that this is working. So I've added a bunch of code here, not even that much, but with the annotation in place, I should be able to go back to my site. I'm gonna clear the cache because I think it needs to clear the cache for it to locate this plugin. So I'll go to configuration, performance, clear all caches. Because we added a new file, we need to get Drupal to rebuild its autoloader so that it knows that this class exists and where to find it and so forth. Once it exists, though, I should be able to go to Structure, Block Layout, and see, looks like we're missing something here. Let's go and take another look. You know what we need to do? We need to enable the module. I'm going to go ahead and enable that module. Extend, turn the module on, of course. Then the block should show up. Okay, now with the module enabled, I can go to Structure, Block Layout. There you go. Under custom blocks, we've got our new Chad block, and I can go ahead and add that block anywhere I want to. I'll just click on it to add it, like so. It pops up the configuration form. This configuration form is provided by the block base class, which we extended. I'll go ahead and place it in the sidebar second region and click Save. So I've now placed my custom block somewhere on the page. If I navigate back to my site, you can see our block is appearing in the right column, and it has the text hello world because it called our build method, which returned a renderable array with the text hello world. Awesome. What about other things we can do with a block? Another one is back in our code. If we're looking at the block plugin interface, this is where I can get an idea of what methods I could or should implement in my block class to influence the way that this block behaves. Build is the obvious one. I want to display some content. Without a build method, your block doesn't really do a whole lot. Access is another one that's really helpful. Access indicates whether or not the block should be shown. So we could go ahead and implement this in our custom block. I'll just copy and paste this code like so. Switch back to my Chad block here. I'm going to add a public function named access. We'll use the same inherit doc comment for that method, like so. I've also, you'll see here, I'm now going to be using this account interface class because the $account variable that's passed into this method implements that interface. So I'll need to make sure I add a use statement for that up here. I'll add the use Drupal core account interface. And without this line, and it should say use, not user. Without this line, PHP is going to throw an error because it won't know where to find this account interface class. Now here, the documentation said, I simply need to return a Boolean value, true or false. If it's true, the block will display. If it's false, the block will not display. So I could do something like this just as an example. I'm going to change this to return false. If I switch back to our site and refresh the page, you'll see that our block is no longer displayed because we're denying access. And what I might want to do is actually provide a more complex logic to determine whether or not someone should be able to view this block. It wouldn't necessarily just be return false or return true. Return true is the default. So if we did not implement this access method, block base implements it for us and it says return true. But I could perform more complex logic here if I wanted to. Looking at the plugin interface again, other things that we could implement for a block block form here is interesting. This one allows me to make changes to the configuration form. Let's go ahead and implement that. I'll copy and paste this into my block. Like so. We'll just copy the inherit doc. Like so. Now, I'm just to prove that this is working, I'll do a debug form. So, like that. I'm going to set this access back to true so that we can actually see our block again. And if I switch over to our site and click refresh, I've got our block, it's visible again. If I configure the block, I get an error. Yeah, it looks like we're getting a white screen. I think I know what's going on here actually. If we switch back to our code quick, what happened is I overrode this block form method, but I didn't call the parent method. So really nothing is happening right now. Block form needs to return something. So it needs to return form, or a form array, like so. But it also needs to have created that form array and get all of the data from the parent method. So we'll do that like this. We'll say parent block form. All right. So now I've got a new variable $form, which is calling, or will be the value returned by block base, block form method. And I can look at that here, block base. We can find the block form method. So I'm not actually returning anything at the moment, but we're going to allow it to continue to, we'll keep calling the parent here because that's a good thing to do. And then return that. Let's see if we save that and go back to our site and hit refresh again. There we go. It's now displaying the block configuration page because it actually knows what form to display. And you can see that it's also printing out the content of the $form variable because we call debug in our custom method. There we can get a sense of all of the things that make up that form. What if I wanted to add something to this form? So this is the form here. Let's take a look at adding a text field to this form, or just a field. Back in my code, I might do something like, instead of printing debug form here, if I wanted to add a new field, I might do form. We'll just come up with a form element here. How about this? We'll create a new form element with the type of date, and we'll save this configuration, and then we'll collect a date that will allow us to say this block should be displayed only if this date has not passed. So the block will be displayed up until this date. So we create a new date element like so. So this is what that'll look like. I'll talk more about this line here, the config Chad block settings, in just a second. I just want to confirm that this actually worked. So I'll save that, switch back to my site, and hit refresh. And we've got a new field here. This is the field we just added in the new Drupal 8 date element. And we can indeed go ahead and choose a date. And so we could choose Saturday's date. And that looks great. The thing is now we actually need to save this value when somebody clicks the Save Block button. If we switch back to our code, the way to do that with blocks is to use the set configuration value and get configuration methods from the block base class that we extended. So block base here provides a couple of additional methods like get configuration, which returns the current configuration for a block, and a set configuration value method, which has a key, which takes two arguments, a key value pair, and it stores that information and ultimately saves it when someone clicks save on our block. It's a little bit different than the, say, config management that we've seen before. This is block specific, but if you want to save configuration for a block, this is the way to do it, using the set configuration value to set a value and get configuration to return the current configuration for the block. So over in our code, what I would need to do here is actually implement the block submit method. This is also part of the block plugin interface. And what it is just a method that will be called when somebody submits the block form. So we can do that here. I've then, in my block submit method, called this set configuration value, which will, as a result, call the set configuration value method for this class, our Chad block, which we're not implementing it, but the block base class implements it. So we inherit it from block base. We can say, here's the key, the name of the configuration thing we'd like to store, and here's the value extracted from the form state array passed into our submit handler. I can then adjust my block form method up here and add something like this. I can say config this get configuration. So now it's creating a new config variable that contains whatever was saved as the configuration for this block, which will, after we've submitted the form once, contain a Chad block settings key we set down here in our submit handler. And now I'm saying if there's a value for that configuration, let's go ahead and pre-populate this date field with that value. Let's take a look at all of this working. Over on our site, I can hit refresh. What I expect is I'll be able to fill out this form. So I'll add a date, we'll say Saturday. And when I click save, Drupal ends up calling the block submit method that we just added to our Chad block plugin and saves the data because we use the set configuration value method there. So when I go back to configure the block again, we've reloaded the configuration and added it to the form so we can see the existing value. And we can confirm that the save method is actually working because our value is still there. So that's cool. I can add fields to the configuration for my block and pretty easily save or alter the configuration. Let's make use of this configuration in our access method now. So back in my code, under the access method, right now we're just returning true. So this is again that if it returns true, display the block. If it returns false, don't display the block. So what I want to do is load our configuration, calling the this get configuration method, which again calls get configuration provided by the block base class. This is really the big benefit of using block base, is all of these helpers like this. And then I could add some code that says if the date stored in configuration is greater than or equal to today's date, go ahead and display the block or return true, otherwise return false. And that might look something like this. If there is a value in Chad block settings configuration, convert it to a Unix timestamp using PHP string to time function. And if that timestamp is greater than the request time, so right now, return false, don't display the block, otherwise return true. Save that. We can switch back over to our site. And if I navigate to the home page, and refresh, you can see our block is currently displaying because it's got a date set in the future. And if I configure the block and I set the date to something in the past, like say, I don't know, April 3rd, and click save, the block is no longer displayed because the logic in our access function says this date has already passed, stop displaying the block. Awesome. So quick review. We took a look at creating a block in Drupal 8 using the block plugin API. The sort of basic things we needed to do were create a new class using the PSR0 naming convention of where we should locate the file that contains the class and the namespace that we should use. We named ours Chad block and we placed it inside of the Chad module directory lib Drupal Chad plugin block Chad block. That pattern will be exactly the same for every block you implement. Just substitute in the name of your module where I've got Chad in mine. If I had more than one block, I would place the file for each block inside of this plugin block directory. Then I created a new class named Chad block, which extends the block base class. The block base class extends the block plugin interface, and the interface defines what methods we can and should implement on our block class in order to interact with the block system. The other important part is this annotation that we added. The annotation is how the plugin system in Drupal 8 is able to discover our block class and understand that it is indeed a block plugin and that it should be loaded in the admin interface and treated as a block. We then took a look at implementing a couple of different methods. We implemented the build method to display some content, the access method, which returned true or false if we wanted the block to show up for people or not, depending on whatever logic we need for our use case, and also how we can manipulate the block configuration form and store configuration data with our block. So all kinds of options here. Most of this I was able to figure out just through trial and error and a lot of looking at the way that core dealt with blocks, copying and pasting those things and fiddling around, changing values, just kind of getting an idea of, oh, this is what the set configuration value function does. Here's how I can make use of it. So I encourage you to do the same. Look at the way that core is implementing various blocks and copy and paste that, make changes and get a better understanding of how the block system works so that you can create awesome blocks for your site that your users will be able to place using the new blocks and layouts system.